Elizabeth I had an extraordinary collection of jewels. Many of these she inherited as heirlooms of the crown, passed on from her brother Edward and sister Mary, and many of them were collected by their father, Henry VIII, who is said to have had more jewels than any prince in Christendom. In this video, I want to discuss just one of those jewels, one of Elizabeth I's favourites. It is known as the Three Brothers, or the Three Brethren, and had a quite remarkable history. It has since vanished. When it first came to England in 1551, it was already 150 years old, and it was famous throughout Europe. Two portraits of Elizabeth I depict the Queen wearing this jewel, the famous ermine portrait by William Cigar, and a less well-known portrait of Elizabeth from the 1580s where she's holding an olive branch. The jewel was so associated with Elizabeth's personal image that she was even portrayed wearing it on her tomb in Westminster Abbey, although the present depiction of the jewel on her effigy is a modern replica of the stolen original. The jewel consisted of three large rectangular balas rubies set in gold surrounding a single very fine pointed diamond. It was embellished with three freshwater pearls and a fourth larger pearl drop that was pendant from the jewel. Both portraits portray this jewel in some detail. In the ermine portrait in Hatfield House, one of the portraits of the Queen owned by her last secretary Robert Cecil, the jewel is suspended from an enormous chain of pearls, diamonds and rubies, a chain that was commonly worn by her father and is shown in several paintings of him, including the Whitehall Palace mural by Holbein. The painting of Elizabeth holding an olive branch was a gift from the Queen to Francois de Seville, a man whose story is worth another video, and it remained in his family until the 18th century and then in a French private collection. It was sold in 2013 by Christie's, and here we see the jewel suspended once again from the same chain as in the ermine portrait, but in this portrait the jewel is more easily seen due to the light colour of the Queen's dress. After Elizabeth died in 1603, James I, her successor, continued to wear the Three Brothers, but not from a chain, but in his hat. The jewel was already old in the mid-16th century when it came to England. It was commissioned in 1387 by a then 16-year-old boy, John, Count of Nevers, who was a member of a cadet branch of the French royal family, but a branch that within decades would be in the first rank on the European stage. John's father, Philip, was the fourth and youngest son of King John II of France and had been made Duke of Burgundy in 1363 as a reward for the courage he had shown aged 14 at the Battle of Poitiers fighting against the English. It is that courage that also gave him the nickname Philip the Bold. John, Count of Nevers' mother was Margaret, Countess of Flanders, the heiress of considerable landholdings in the Low Countries. In 1404, at the death of his father, Duke Philip the Bold, John succeeded as Duke of Burgundy, and in 1405 he inherited most of his mother's lands too. As John, Duke of Burgundy, the ruler of Flanders, he was known as John the Fearless, and he had extraordinary power, wealth and prestige. Quite unbelievably, about 20 years ago, the original bill and receipt for the purchase of the Three Brothers jewel by John was discovered by chance in the Côte d'Or Departmental Archives in Dijon. The bill was dated the 11th of October 1387 and the receipt for payment the 24th of November, and it named a Parisian goldsmith called Herman Roussel as the craftsman who created this glorious jewel. Roussel, who died in 1420, was the top goldsmith in Paris at the time and made innumerable items both for John and also for his first cousin, King Charles VI of France. Large rubies like those set in this jewel were known as balas rubies in the 15th and 16th centuries, as they were mined in an area Europeans referred to as Balasia, the ancient name for Badakhshan in modern-day Tajikistan. Since the 18th century, it has been known that these large balas rubies are chemically different from true rubies, and they are now usually referred to as spinels. Spinels are worth a fraction today of the value of true rubies. However, in the medieval and early modern periods, balas rubies from Balasia were highly prized. Rubies of all types were considered to have talismanic properties. Books called lapidaries were popular in the late medieval and early modern period and argued that stones and gems of all types had particular properties about them. Wearing rubies, it was believed, could ensure the wearer's health and dispel evil thoughts, bring victory, encourage peace, and prevent the chance of being poisoned. It was believed that a ruby would darken in colour if there was danger for the wearer on the horizon. You can understand why great lords wanted them. And the bigger the ruby, the greater the talismanic effect, which accounts for the medieval obsession with these large ballast rubies. In the early years of the 15th century, when Duke John of Burgundy was in conflict with his cousin, the King of France, Charles VI, he pawned the jewel, but at his death in 1419 he had possession of it again, and it was passed then to his son and heir, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. It is an inventory from Philip's reign where we first hear the name of this jewel as Les Trois Frères, the Three Brothers. When Philip the Good died in 1467, the jewel was then inherited by his son, Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and he would ultimately lose it. In 1476, the year before his death, Charles took the jewel with him on campaign against the Swiss. He likely kept it with him for its protective qualities. In February of 1476, his campaign came to a head when he besieged the Swiss castle of Granson, which he eventually conquered. And in an action that was very much against the laws of chivalry and greatly angered the Swiss, Charles had the whole castle garrison executed. He then set up camp to the north of the town of Granson, where he lived in great state. For when Charles went on military campaign, he always took luxurious goods with him to furnish his tent. He liked his comforts. He met the Swiss in battle on the 2nd of March at the Battle of Granson, a battle that would prove disastrous for him in more ways than one. He'd chosen his position badly, and the Swiss advanced against his forces on two fronts. After engaging the first cohort of Swiss troops and being unable to hold their line, Charles ordered his troops back to a higher piece of ground. And as they were retreating, the second cohort of Swiss troops arrived and they routed their Burgundians. And as the panicking Burgundians fled the field, they abandoned their camp, including Duke Charles's fancy tent and all his precious belongings, which were then looted by the Swiss. It was payday for the troops. Well, most of the goods that the Swiss looted, including the three brothers, somehow came into the possession of the magistrates of Basel. This was such a resounding victory for them in more ways than one that they created this record drawing as some of the fine objects they looted from Charles's tent, including items of his clothing, his furniture from his chapel, and some of his silver and jewellery. In 1476, Basel was an imperial city of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Holy Roman Emperor of the time, Frederick III, was allied to Charles the Bold. In fact, in 1477, after Charles the Bold's death, Frederick's son Maximilian would marry Mary of Burgundy, Charles's daughter and heiress. So the magistrates of Basel very sensibly kept quiet about possessing the three brothers and all the other loot, important heirlooms of the House of Burgundy that were now, in theory, heirlooms of the imperial house. However, in 1501, the political position of Basel changed dramatically. The city was asked to join the Swiss Confederacy. Newly independent of imperial authority, and with a quarter of a century passed since the jewel had been looted, the magistrates of Basel felt that they could risk selling the three brothers. In 1501, in preparation for marketing the jewel, they had a scale drawing made of it, the earliest representation of the piece. It is an important piece of evidence, this, as it is how we know that the jewel commissioned by John the Fearless is the same jewel that Elizabeth I wore in her portraits. Being in scale drawing, we can also determine the size of the jewel. It was 8.7 centimetres by 6.9 centimetres. This drawing in the Basel Town Archives also has the deal of sale attached to it, which dates from 1505, in which the size and quality of the stones is revealed. The ballast rubies were each a whopping 70 carats, and the pointed diamond that they surrounded was of 30 carats. The magistrates were very cautious when it came to approaching a sale. Afraid of being accused of embezzlement, they called on the services of an expert middleman to arrange the sale for them. They chose Hans Voltaire von Worms, a German-born Venetian merchant. He then began negotiations with Jakob Fugger, an Augsburg merchant and banker who was reputed at the time to be the richest man in Europe. Fugger was effectively bankrolling the Emperor Maximilian and was virtually untouchable in his actions. A deal was done, and the three brothers, along with several other important jewels from the Burgundian loot, passed into Fugger's hands in 1505 in return for 40,200 guilders, which was a staggering sum of money for the early 16th century. Fugger was investing much of his wealth in fine objects that could be used as an alternative to cash should the need arise if cash was limited in supply. In the 1530s, when the Emperor Charles V and the Archduke Ferdinand wanted funds, he offered the jewel to them as an alternative to a loan, which they refused. In 1544, Henry VIII of England decided to invade France, and he needed funds, and so he went to the financial markets on the continent to raise part of the necessary money. His agents approached Jasper Douch, who was an Antwerp merchant and an associate of the Fuggers. Douch was willing to provide a loan to the king, backed by the Fuggers, so long as the king accepted part of it in jewels rather than in cash. The three brothers were among the jewels that Henry was then offered. Negotiations continued, but ended with Henry's death in 1547. The jewel eventually came into the hands of the English crown when Edward VI renegotiates a £60,000 loan he has with the Fuggers, a loan no doubt taken out by his father, and repayments were imminent. In April of 1551, Edward VI wrote in his chronicle, his diary of state affairs, that he had bargained with the Fuggers and had managed to get an extension to the loan by paying more interest, increasing his debt by 12,000 marks, and agreeing to purchase from the Fuggers a jewel for 100,000 marks. The jewel in question is undoubtedly the three brothers. Edward describes it as a very fair jewel, with rubies marvellous big and one orient and great diamond, which accords with the earlier descriptions. So the jewel was added to the crown jewels and was included in an updated inventory of Henry VIII's possessions. It arrived in England in June of 1551. In 1553, the jewel was inherited by Mary I, where it is referred to in an inventory of September 1553 in great detail. A great pendant bought of the Fuggers in Flanders, having 3 large balances set without foil, 1 large pointed diamond, and 4 large pearls, whereof 1 is pendant. Such references in English documents prove with certainty that this jewel in the possession of the English crown in the 1550s was the one in Basel in 1500 and the one commissioned by John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, in the 1380s. It is such a wonderful trail of evidence. In 1606, James I declared the jewel an heirloom of the crown that could not be sold or alienated. Up to this point, the jewel had seemingly remained unaltered from its 1387 form. However, in 1623, James I commissioned George Heriot, his jeweller, to remodel it for him. The stones were all reset to show them off to better effect. When Heriot took apart the original jewel, he was particularly astonished at the size of the diamond, which was very much obscured by the late medieval gold setting. There was a good reason for James to commission this work in 1623. The jewel was to be pressed into service. James had long been planning a Spanish match between his son Charles, Prince of Wales, and the Spanish Infanta, and in March of 1623 it was proposed that Charles, with the Duke of Buckingham, would make a surprise visit to the Spanish court. And James sent to his son the remade three brothers as the primary jewel for him to wear during this expedition. it wasn't the most diplomatic of gestures. The jewel was still famous throughout Europe as a former heirloom of the Burgundians, and the House of Habsburg, the royal house of Spain, were the heirs of the Burgundian Valois. Unsurprisingly, nothing came of the match. In March of 1624, shortly before his death, and in an alliance with the United Provinces of the Netherlands, James I declared war on Habsburg Spain. When he then died in 1625, he left a very tricky inheritance for his heir Charles I, and once again war would determine the fate of the jewel. In 1626, to offset some of the great expense of war, Charles I approached the banker Francis van Herven in Amsterdam and pawned the jewel and other items from the royal collection. The jewel was still in the hands of Van Herven in 1634, but in 1639 the king somehow managed to scrape together the money to redeem it again, but it would not be for long. Charles's money worries would continue. By 1639 the king had ruled without parliament for 10 years. His rule was failing and the country was heading quickly towards civil war. In March of 1642, with the commencement of the First English Civil War, Charles's French queen, Henrietta Maria, was dispatched to The Hague, and there she tried to sell many jewels from the royal collection to support the royalist military cause. She didn't find many willing buyers, and eventually returned with the three brothers unsold. In 1645, with the king's cause failing, the queen fled to France, and she is advanced 104,000 guilders by Thomas Kletcher and Joachim de Wickfort for the jewel. There is evidence that Kletcher then reset the stones on behalf of the Queen, and the jewel may well have been rebranded as the Three Sisters at that time to hide its provenance from suspicious buyers who might be wary of purchasing such a royal heirloom. The last we hear of the three brothers is in a letter of 1650, when it is still in the possession of Kletcher in The Hague. A jewel named the Three Brothers, by others the Three Sisters, being a jewel that King James did use to wear upon his hat, it is referred to. This remarkable jewel, once prized throughout Europe, the centrepiece of Elizabeth I's collection, a jewel that changed hands due to the fortunes of war, hasn't been seen since 1650. How can such large stones just disappear into thin air? One wonders if one day this beautiful and enigmatic jewel, so rich in European history, may resurface in some dusty museum or country house collection. Wouldn't that be amazing? Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.